Alright, welcome to our video on section 7 where we talk about solving equations. We'll start out with linear equations where here you distribute first, so you get 8x plus 4 and then equals 29 plus 6x minus 15. Combine like terms on the right hand side and you get 29 minus 15, which is 14. Then you move the x's over, so you get 2x. Move the numbers over to get 10, divide by 2, and you get x equals 5. The second problem deals with fractions. And remember, if you have fractions, the easiest way to do this would be to multiply by the lowest common denominator. In this case, the lowest common denominator would be 12. So you're going to take that 12 and you're going to multiply it by each term to get rid of the fractions. When you do that, notice that 4 goes into 12 3 times, 3 goes into 12 4 times. So basically you're left with 3 times x plus 2 minus 4 times x minus 1 equals 24. And notice we've gotten rid of the fractions. So then we just distribute negative 4x, negative 4 times negative 1 is positive 4. Then you get negative x plus 10 equals 24. Subtract, so you get negative x equals 14. Divide by negative 1 to get x equals negative 14. Key thing is here, multiply it by the lowest common denominator whenever you have fractions, because you want to clear the fractions. So that brings us to rational equations, where you have a rational expression and you want to get rid of the denominator. The first thing you want to do is factor the denominators. So notice x squared plus 4x minus 12 factors to x plus 6 and x minus 2. So that means the next thing you want to do is figure out what would be the lowest common denominator. Well, if you have x plus 6 and then x minus 2, and that's what you have on this side over here, then basically that's your lowest common denominator. So step 3, to clear the fractions, we're going to multiply by the lowest common denominator. So when we multiply by the lowest common denominator for each term, we have to multiply by x minus 2 and x plus 6 each term. So, when you do that, now you notice you can cancel out the fractions. So notice the x minus 2's cancel, then here both of them cancel. So now you're left with 3 times x minus 2 plus x plus 6, because 1 times anything, equals 4. And now you can just go ahead and distribute and then solve. So you get 4x equals 4, x equals 1. And notice x equals 1 will work because that is not a restriction on the domain. The restriction on the domain would be x cannot equal negative 6 and x cannot equal 2. So your answer works. So go ahead and try this one on your own. Pause it if you like, because then I'm going to go ahead and do it for you. The least common denominator here, if you factor this, it would be x plus 2 and x minus 2. So your least common denominator is x plus 2 and x minus 2. So you go ahead and multiply by x plus 2 and x minus 2. Then notice that you start crossing out. So you're left with x minus 2 equals 4 minus 1 times x plus 2. Now remember, you got to distribute this negative sign. So x minus 2 equals 4 minus x minus 2. X minus 2 equals 2 minus x. So then we add x both sides. So we get 2x. Add 2. So you get 2x equals 4. And that means x equals 2. Now, the only thing you have to keep in mind is that 2 would make the bottom of the fraction up here equal to 0. 2 is a restriction. So therefore, 2 does not work, and you would have no solution. So you do have to check your answers to make sure that they work, that they do not make the denominator equal to 0. Absolute value equations. First thing you want to do is isolate the absolute value. So here, by isolating the absolute value, you'd add 20 to both sides. Then you divide by 4. Now, once you've isolated the absolute value, remember there's two equations for absolute value. There's one for the original, which means 1 minus 2x equals 5, and one for the opposite. What I mean by opposite is that 1 minus 2x would equal negative 5. Because if it equals negative 5 in here, you take the absolute value, it's still 5. So you figure out and solve these. So you subtract 1, so you get negative 2x equals 4, and x equals negative 2. And then subtract, so you get negative 2x equals negative 6, and x equals 3. So there are two answers. X could equal negative 2 or 3. Solving by factoring. Remember, the first thing you need to do is to set them equal to 0. So in this case, you need to move the 1 over. So you get 2x squared plus x minus 1 equals 0. Then you need to factor. And remember that here you're going to multiply the first and the last to get negative 2. So the factors of negative 2 that add to 1 are positive 2 and negative 1. Remember, when it's 2 in front, you got to factor by grouping. So you rewrite the middle term. Then you group. So 2x, so that's x plus 1. Here they have a negative 1 in common. And then, so it's x plus 1 and 2x minus 1. Then remember, you set each factor equal to 0. So you get x equals negative 1, and in this case 2x minus 1 equals 0, so you get x equals 1/2. Those are your two answers. I'll let you do the other examples on your own. I will tell you the answers here. You can pause it if you want to do them, but x equals 0 and x equals 3. And then the answer here is, for the factoring one, is that x equals 5 and x equals 3. Those are your two answers for there. There's the square root method to solve quadratic equations as well. What basically means is you want to isolate the squared. So in this case, isolating the squared, now it won't write. Isolating the squared means basically here dividing by 3. So you get x squared equals 9. Then take the square root. And when you take the square root, remember it's plus or minus. So it's x equals plus or minus 3. Here, isolating the squared means dividing by 3. So you get x minus 4 squared equals 5. You take the square root of both sides. Remember, when you take the square root of the right, it's plus or minus. Square root of squared just eliminates the squared sign. And you get plus or minus squared 5. You add 4. And remember, this plus or minus is like a wall. So the 4 doesn't pass it, so it becomes 4 plus or minus the square root of 5. You have two answers, 4 plus the square root of 5, 4 minus the square root of 5. The next way you can solve equations is the quadratic formula. Remember, a quadratic formula comes from the quadratic equation ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And some of you probably sing, and you got a song to kind of remember it, but I won't sing for you. A equals 1, b equals 5, c equals 3 here. So then you just put those in the quadratic formula. So you get negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 5 squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. So you have negative 5 plus or minus the square root of, well, 5 squared is 25 minus 12 all over 2, so negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 13 over 2. And you can't simplify that any further. I'm going to skip the next one for right now and just talk about the discriminant, which helps you to determine the number of solutions. The discriminant is a part of the quadratic formula. It's the b squared minus 4ac part. And basically there are 3 possible answers for the discriminant. The discriminant can be positive. B squared minus 4ac is greater than 0, which means you get 2 answers. Kind of like when we did our example, notice the discriminant was a positive 13, so therefore we got 2 answers, negative 5 plus the square root of 13 over 2 and negative 5 minus. When b squared minus 4ac is equal to 0, if the discriminant is 0, that means you just get 1 answer. And if the discriminant is less than 0, then you have no real answers. All your answers would be imaginary because it's going to be negative under the square root. So a sample problem would be like this. Determine the number of and type of solutions for each problem. So here A is 1, B is negative 4, C is negative 5. You find the discriminant, so b squared minus 4ac so you get 16 minus, well, 4 times 1 is 4 times negative 5 is negative 20, or you could do negative 4 times 1 is negative 4 times negative 5 is positive 20. So you get 36, which means you get 2 solutions. So go ahead and do the next one on your own. You can pause it if you like. Basically, it's going to turn out after you subtract 7 and do the discriminant is that you get 37, and that gives you 2 solutions. Solving radical equations, the last type of equations that we're going to solve. You want to isolate the radical on one side. So basically subtract 2. Raise both sides to the nth power, which means you're going to eliminate the radical by squaring both sides. And when you square this expression, you're going to have to FOIL. So you get 2x minus 1, because the squared eliminates the square root. And x minus 2 squared, remember you FOIL. So you get x squared minus 4x plus 4. And then you solve the resulting equation by subtracting 2x from both sides and adding 1. And then you can factor, you get x minus 5 and x minus 1. So you get x equals 5 and x equals 1. And you want to check for extraneous solutions, meaning that work. So if you check, like for example, 2 times 1 minus 1 plus 2, does that equal 1? And 2 times 1 is 2, minus 1 is 1, plus 2. And 1 plus 2 is 3, 3 equals 1. That is not true, so that is an extraneous solution. Whereas if you put 5 in, it will work. So 5 is your only answer. So go ahead and try this one on your own, doing the same thing. Any questions, please feel free to ask in class.